Welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's military history told through the stories of those who've served. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and let's get started. G'day friends, and welcome to the episode. Now there's a little bit to get through before we start. Well, earlier this month I sat down over Zoom with Melissa Ratliff. She's the host of God's Favourites podcast. So it may sound a little bit different, as this was the first time where I'm actually the host, and as during the course of the episode, I actually started to lose my voice as we progressed. But before we get into my chat with Melissa, a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. Please make sure to check out the podcast out on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and Mastodon at IWODMJ. There you'll find all my travels around Australia, finding the myriad of memorials that dot the countryside. And while there, also join our growing community on the Discord. In the episode description, you'll find the link to show notes, photos, and supplementary information that didn't get into the episode, as well as ways you can support the podcast, as well as links to Melissa and her content. Now that all that is done, let's get started with our conversation already underway.
Lovely. The amount of time it has taken for us to figure this out.
The best part is it nearly didn't happen. Because time zones are a thing.
Time zones are a thing. I said I'd be doing it on Saturday, and it is Saturday for you. And it's Friday night at 8 p.m. in Florida. And I was like, I thought we were doing that tomorrow. Oh, yes. Hi. The quintessential American who does not understand time zones. Hi, welcome.
So welcome everyone. So this obviously that wasn't me. I'm joined today by the incredibly talented friend of mine, Melissa. What do you want, Fair Lady or Ratliff?
You can call me Melissa Ratliff. That's fine. But
Melissa Ratliff.
I am Melissa Fair Lady on TikTok. If you have not wandered that way, we have fun.
Melissa is the host of God's Favourites, a history podcast. And it's very interesting how the Venn diagram of your listener base and my listener base only briefly touch over through history. So we both do content on TikTok, and that's how we found each other. But there's one point in history where our Venn diagrams leap over, and that is your personal beau, your personal obsession, and is of course Charles Lightoller.
Yes. I mean, I think we first actually became friends after we talked about I did a video on the Mephisto tank.
That's right. Yes, Mephisto.
That's how we actually met. But we do have this lovely connection now because we just, that it's a long story that I do think would concern most. But I do have a history obsession, crush, whatever you want to call him, of Titanic's former second officer and Dunkirk hero, Charles Lightoller, which has become somehow my second career. And that's saying something. But
yes.
That's an understatement practically.
Yes. So much so that, and for my listeners wondering, how does Charles Lightoller, second officer of the Titanic, savior of Dunkirk, how does he, for those who don't know, who is Charles Lightoller?
Well, the reason the title of God's Favourites podcast is God's Favourites is because that's how I started referring to Charles Lightoller. Now, I think every child across the world does go through a Titanic phase as a kid. I don't know if that's just if there are anybody who does history I know of, we all start in that phase, at least the neurodivergent ones. We start with this huge Titanic phase and we go through it. And mine was particularly intense as a kid. And I remember who Charles Lightoller was from A Night to Remember, which I don't know if I should have been watching at like age 7 and 8, but I was. And I was like, oh, he's the guy. He just survives Titanic miraculously. And it's a fantastic story I'll get into more. But basically, he survives in this like very, very miraculous mathematical anomaly of he gets pulled down with the ship explodes basically, either when it breaks apart or a boiler hits. He's stuck by a funnel. He gets blown right next to a lifeboat that he had been working on that was overturned. He commandeers it, saves about 30 people that night, but he just basically stays lucky and stayed lucky prior to that. And when I got older, I was listening to another podcast, and it's called Time Suck. I always like to give him credit. Dan Cummins, he did an episode on the Titanic, and he very, very briefly mentioned the entire life story, which involved the trip like from Titanic to Dunkirk, where he saves 130 people. And I was like, I had not heard that when I started looking at this man's life, because that initially, prompted the immediate Google search after I heard this, because I like to go into rabbit holes. And that was the rabbit hole that changed everything for me, at least my TikTok channel for a bit there. I was like, how have I never heard a story of a man who survives 4 shipwrecks and a fire, just could not be killed? So all these near-death incidents, and then goes on to become this mega war hero. And his story is just so fascinating that I became obsessed with it. And I was like, well, I have to learn everything, because that's just what I hyper focus, I suppose. And that became a good chunk of my channel and my content. And that's I got the name God's Favorites because I was kept calling him God's Favorites, because the man, you name it, he survived it by inches. It's just very, very, and it was always like a series of coincidences that led up to him surviving and things just lining up perfectly. I was like, well, that's a God's favorite right there, because just inches of survival. And that led to us bonding, I suppose, over the all the things I've learned now, because it took me into the military history realm, which is your realm more than mine. But I have learned a lot. And that led me to where we are now.
Exactly. And much like myself getting tagged in every single Mephisto or In Your War video, you're tagged in every Titanic video related to lights. But the question is so my listeners are probably wondering, why are we talking about someone who was on the Titanic and Mephisto when this is a military history podcast?
Oh,
and
goodness.
of course, there's one thing that we both have bonded over, we find absolutely hilarious, is there was a conflict before the First World War called the Second Anglo-Boer War, and Lightoller had something involved in that.
I don't even know if he was truly involved or just an agitator. He was just okay. So he's often portrayed so seriously, and I don't like that when he's the only movie you see a glimpse of this man's humor is you get a brief little funny moment in A Night to Remember with him. Every other time he has been Mr. Straight-laced militant, and he was a sailor. But the man's personnel file at White Star Line had to have been, at least 2 feet thick, just from write-ups from pranks. And he tried to cause an international incident with one in particular in Sydney Harbor. And this I love this story because he got away with it, but he later confessed to it many, many years later in his autobiography. But in 1900, I think I got the date wrong in one of my videos, but it was 1900. He's on the, I believe, Swavik or the Runic. I can't remember which ship. I'd have to go back and check. White Star Line. He's on the Australia route. He's known for pranks. Most of them are fairly harmless. He has a habit of slip sliding on the bridge of the ship when he's on watch because it's icy many times, and he learns he can do it without falling over the railing into the ocean. That's one of his favorites. But this one he completes like an absolute homicide with premeditation. He never reveals his cohorts, but he does recruit 2 midshipmen. That's all we know. And in the middle of the night, when they're docked in Sydney Harbor, they somehow procured a piece of calico that they painted to resemble a Boer flag. Of course, Australia being involved by proxy because the United Kingdom and Lightoller has been apparently paying very close attention to the watch schedule at Fort Denison in Sydney Harbor. So
For those who don't know, Fort Denison is the fortress island at the mouth of Port Jackson, which leads to Sydney Harbor.
And these are in the shark infested waters. He and his friends commandeer some sort of ship to row out in the dark cover of night. And it's the premeditation for me. I cannot stress how long this must have taken to plan, because they knew the night watchman's schedule. And they get to the island. I don't have an exact amount of time. It's just sometime in the middle of the night. And they have 3 of them involved. And there was apparently some sort of lightning rod that runs up one of the sides of the pillars that he climbs up that with the poorly, I should say, this is not an accurate depiction of a Boer flag at all. I wish I had a picture. We don't, but it was apparently not done. It looked like a school child's art project hastily made. And he crawls up while his 2 unidentified cohorts cause some sort of diversion on the other side that gets the night watchman's attention, at which point he plays his famous one gun salute prank, in which he lights a fuse of some variety, gets in time to get down off of the scurries back down the lightning rod where he's left the Boer flag hanging, and jumps back into the boat with his cohorts as there is the loud explosion that wakes up most of Sydney Harbor, who thinks they are now being attacked or something. and he scurries back. I don't know how they did not get caught. They're in a boat. I'm not sure how far out they were or how far their ship was docked, but they made it back as people are like running out of their homes in the middle of the night trying to find out what happened. And the next, I think it's the next day in the Sydney Morning Herald, I'd have to pull up the article, but it describes the chaos left by somebody who they have worked out it was a prank, but it did cause this like immediate panic in the aftermath of what just happened, who scaled a fort, who climbed up a lightning rod and left a poorly and they note how terribly designed the flag is, which apparently he thought that was the best part of the entire thing. He kept a copy of the newspaper article like a serial killer. He kept it. He was so proud of the description because they at the last part is that at best it was mad-brained business is how they describe it, and he loved that.
Yep.
And he kept it. Yeah, you've got it pulled up. Oh, yes.
As you've been looking, so I found it. So in historical context, Australia is not a country yet. So that's 1901, 1st of January 1901. So this is the colony of New South Wales still. And the argument is the episode is reported gunfire at Fort Denison. The report sent to the police the other day on the 12th of October, 1900, that someone had fired a gun at Fort Denison has not yet been cleared up. The charge of the island is in the hands of the Department of Navigation. Last Saturday morning, the Superintendent of Navigation, Captain Eddy, received a report from the caretaker of the island, which was stated that a charge had been fired from the gun atop of the turret early that morning. The matter was placed in the hands of police, who have since been investigating the affair. The joke was accentuated by a piece of painted calico being left on the place, said Captain Eddy yesterday. I have never seen a Boer flag, so I can't say whether it was one or not. But in the order for it to get the blank charge into the gun and fire, the man, I think, would have to have climbed up the lightning conductor. Nobody was hurt, and at best, it was a foolish and mad-brained business. And this is on this is on page, page 4 of the Sydney Morning Herald of that day.
The pride, and it was not immediately clear who had done it. The Australian authorities, of course, they were investigating, but nothing ever came of it. However, I guess word traveled quickly because the next day he was on the carpet at the White Star Line with one of his superiors. The dedication to the prank was just, further hit home by the fact that he had already written up a letter of resignation in case he had been caught red-handed. And I suppose somebody squilled, or of course they just figured out who it was by reputation. To which point he's getting a dressing down of doing these things while in White Star uniform, because apparently he was wearing his uniform when he went out. That was just extra. And he offers his resignation, and the man who is yelling at him then starts cracking up. And he's just like, don't do that again. And he's like, okay. But so he tears up the letter of resignation, and for a while he is removed from the Australia. He's eventually put back on it in like 1902, 1903. But he was put on the Atlantic service for a bit after that, just to avoid any more international incidents. But the pride and the fact that it never really came out until he confessed to it in his autobiography. And I was he went 10 toes down for his co-conspirators. He never named who they were. I have some suspicions because he did have some very close friends on the crew, but other than that, he never named those individuals. He let them be. But he was very, very, very proud of the one gun salute, and that's what he always referred to it as. And it woke up most of Sydney Harbor, I'm told.
Well, he must have had a fondness for Australia because his wife, Sylvia, was also Australian.
She was, and he met her on the Swayvik on a return trip. My parents have always been like, "Why aren't you married yet?" And I'm like, apparently, all I needed to do was go on a ship because Sylvia was bound back for Sydney from she'd been studying in the UK Her mother ran an inn, I think, somewhere. I'm not sure the exact province or whatever, but she was on her way back. And she was born with a club foot, so she walked with a cane, but she was very happy going around. No one will ever be able to convince me that she did not do this on purpose, because they hit a wave and she just falls right into Charles Lightoller's arms. And that's how they met. And they got married. They got off the boat and got married like 6 days later. I
The
was like,
classic
oh,
Hallmark movie
well,
moment.
it sounded like fan fiction. I was like, good grief. Okay, hello, meet cute. But it was very funny because I mean, she had a person that she had been in an understanding with, relationship with, and I think he just got a letter, because I mean, off the boat they got married, and then they got back on this wave and went back to the UK where they started a family, and she lived there for the rest of her life. I was like, okay, but he did
And
have
that
a fondness for Australian women that has been noted. It wasn't just Sylvia. Prior to, I mean, he was in Sydney Harbor a lot, and he did have a fondness for the lovely women in Sydney Harbor. So
and
that is noted. I never talked about it much on the podcast. I was like, to respect all relationships and weddings, we shall leave that there. But he did have a fondness for the Aussies. Yes, he did.
so the Lightollers have 5 children, and this is important because it goes into the Second World War. After obviously after Lights has survived the sinking of the Titanic, he served in the First World War briefly,
Yes, he was in the
and then
Dover Patrol. Yes.
yes,
And the
and
Dover
then
Patrol is very important, actually, if I may interject
yeah,
there. The Dover Patrol is important because he was doing torpedo boat. He was on the torpedo boat duty. That obviously that was an issue for most ocean liners at the time. So they had torpedo boat escorts, but his route took him from around I think close to Ramsgate or thereabout up through to Dunkirk. So he was very familiar with where Dunkirk was prior to the Second World War. So he served on, he was a commander, and then he went back to the White Star Line, and eventually anyone associated with the Titanic kind of had a difficult time in progressing up the ladder after the First World War. They were being mostly, trying to avoid any connotations with it. So he ended up resigning and kind of just living quietly until World War II broke out. And
so
yeah, that's where we get into the Dunkirk and the
so
Lightoller.
in 1930, something interesting happens for Lights, and that is the launch of a motor yacht, a four-stroke engine motor yacht that was found sitting. What is it?
It was in
Sitting in a.
Sylvia found it in a wrecking yard in 1929. The synchronicity is lovely because the boat was a pinnace. It was a steam pinnace. They only the number was rubbed off of it. And they only know that it was made in 1912, the year the Titanic sank. So that was a big year for Lights. And they find this boat, and they were going to call her the Hobo, which Lightoller used to refer to himself as a hobo because he at one point had gone over to North America, Canada, to try to find gold in the Yukon. He wasn't very good at it. So he called it hoboing, hoboed his way back to Europe to go back to work for the White Star Line, or to start work for the White Star Line. And Sylvia didn't like that term, but she suggested Sundowner, meaning the exact same thing in Australia slang at the time. So Sundowner became her name. And that boat has become very important to me. I mean, obviously it's important to Light's story, and I love that, but I'll get into why I love the boat later. But this boat is a huge part of the Lightoller family's story.
And then, especially considering that, so 1939, Second World War starts.
Yes.
Was it 3 of Lights' children involved in the war,
yes, he has
4?
3 sons. He had 3. I don't know if his daughters did anything in terms of nursing or any sort of volunteering. I don't know that. But I do know he had 3 sons. And prior to this, the Sundowner was just a family yachting boat, but it also served. Lightoller was known to the Admiralty, obviously for he was well known just as a fun sailor. Prior to the war breaking out, though, he used Sundowner, in addition to taking lovely little family trips and sailing it around, used it for some espionage for the British government, which I love. Because they just knew Lights as the guy who ran around the channel during World War I, and he was always really quite astute at observing things. So they said, "Why don't you take your boat on a little fishing trip off the coast of Germany. And you take a camera, and we'll get some photos of some of the islands around Germany and just the coastline. And he asked if he can take Sylvia with him, because he figures if he has his old lady with him, it'll look more like a couple just out having a wonderful time. So I don't know why Sylvia chose this specifically as her, but Sylvia, they agreed to allow her in on the intelligence. And Sylvia just took some potatoes and just peeled potatoes on the deck while Lightoller went below. I don't know why the potatoes. I don't know whose idea that was, but she sat on the deck, and sure enough, they said if you do get stopped, ditch the camera, ditch the film. Well, sure enough, they get boarded by the German Coast Guard. And Sylvia's on deck, peeling the potatoes, and she's like, she thinks they're asking, where's your who's the boat? Lightoller doesn't throw out the camera. He instead grabs a bottle of bourbon, knocks his hat around and spills some on his shirt, and just comes up and acts like he's drunk. And
Yep.
and Sylvia's just incredibly embarrassed, and she just covers her face, and the German Coast Guard guys just start laughing and let him go. But it was just a ruse, which I just thought that was quite clever. I was like, that was quick thinking. That was very quick-witted. So the potato peeling and the drunken act worked fine, and they got that film developed by the Admiralty. But the Admiralty was already aware of Sundowner prior to the invasion, so that he had done a little bit of covert work with that in 38 or 39. And then the Lightoller's youngest son joined the RAF, the Royal Air Force. And Lightoller actually had a fear of flying, which I found kind of sad given the situation involving his son, but also just ironic because he survived everything else. I'm like, you'll be out in this North Atlantic or in a field of icebergs on a boat and be fine, but you're scared of flying. Okay. But he didn't like he went on a few planes in World War I just kind of as a testing like the second bit, and he didn't fly it. He was just kind of as a passenger. He hated it. And he told his son, though, that it didn't seem like a fair advantage between boats and planes because, the Luftwaffe was like the German war machine was intense, and they had these incredible planes. And he's having a conversation with his youngest son, Brian, over breakfast one morning, and they're talking, I think, about the Stuttgart. I can't remember the exact plane they're talking about, but he says something about, he's like, even if you don't even if you're not an armed boat and you see one coming for you, all you have to do is watch the nose of the plane. If it dips like 7 degrees, you're locked, and to get out of the way of it. This is just a over breakfast conversation. Now, a few months later, Brian is tragically killed during a night raid in Germany. He gets night blind, and I think he hits a weather balloon or some sort of something. He collides his plane into something, and he passes away. He's actually still buried in Germany. And it comes as a total shock for the entire family because that's the baby of the family. He was 18, barely, if that. And they were all shocked, just that he went so quickly. He was really quite literally one of the first RAF deaths in Germany. So that was a huge, tremendous loss for this family. But they still have their eldest son, Roger, and their middle son, Trevor. So Trevor's going to join the British Expeditionary Forces, and I believe Roger's also in the RAF. He was also a pilot. So they have another pilot, and they have a on the ground guy, and this all comes out very chaotically because Brian dies, and then of course the Nazi invasion of Western Europe begins, with the British Expeditionary Forces, the Free French, heading to the beach while what's left of the Free French forces are trying to hold off the Panzers. So it's a very, very intense. And Trevor, their middle son, is on the beach. He makes it back to the beaches of Dunkirk. So they know they have a son. They've just lost one son. And Trevor is on the beaches of Dunkirk, and Lights, who's had this incredibly lucky go, but the death of Brian hit him very hard. I think just it was the baby of the family. He was the youngest child, so it had hit them particularly hard. And now I'm sure, knowing this situation is getting aggressive, with Hitler and the Nazis pushing everybody, the BAF, all the way out to the beach, is escalating. And so that had to be such a hopeless feeling. And then the phone rings, and the Admiralty says, "Hey, can we have Sundowner?" They're going to take Sundowner to the beach to pick up or to the boats, whatever they can get, to grab some soldiers and bring them back. And they just want to commandeer the boat, which is what happened to most of those boats. It wasn't just like random boaters taking it out. There were a few, but the call had gone out for people who had knowledge of merchant marines, or anybody who had coastal navigation experience. And that goes out, and he's like, "You can have her, but I'm taking her. You're not. Don't touch the boat."
And
Yeah. So that,
while not implicitly stated in the most recent movie Dunkirk, that character who portrays is Lights and his much younger son looking.
So yes, so in Dunkirk there is a character, but I don't know if Christopher Nolan just didn't want to pay royalties, or if that was just sort of a way to take some creative license with it. But what was his Dawson, and I was like, you picked the name Dawson for the guy who was on the Titanic. Excuse you. Okay, first of all, I caught that, you absolute cad. Secondly, the Sundowner became the Moonstone, and I was like, it's when you order Charles Lightoller from Wish. But I loved Mark Rylance's performance in it. But I was like, Dawson, okay.
I never made that comparison before.
I caught it immediately. I was like, you absolute cad. Oh, but that scene was actually quite similar. They're like, if you want the Sundowner, you can have her, which is pretty much exactly what Lightoller wrote, saying to the Admiralty. He was like, you can have her, but I'm driving. It's just, don't touch the car. It's mine. That's his boat. He loves his boat. He's not.
And while,
yeah,
exactly. And so Lights was the exception, not the rule. So even though in the movie Dunkirk, you've got this heroic scene of all of the civilians standing on the rails of their boats as they all rescue the soldiers, 99% of the boats were commandeered by
the Navy. Yeah.
By the Navy.
And they were asking for people who, had, like, the Merchant Marine were obviously involved, and Lights was a Merchant Marine, but he was also Royal Naval Reserve. So he had the credence. They knew who he was. And when he shows up, they're just like, okay, you're much older. You're too old for this, but you know what? Go ahead. And so what he does is he takes Roger, his oldest son, with him. In the movie, the child is portrayed as a much younger character, but he's actually, in his late 30s at that point. So Roger, who is Roger grew up on the boat. He knows the rules of the boat, and they take with them an 18-year-old Sea Scout named Gerald Ashcroft, who, thankfully, the movie, I think, showed that kid got killed, I believe, in a head injury, but Ashcroft was fine.
Yeah, one of the soldiers push him down the stairs or something.
Yeah, the Cillian Murphy character. Spoilers, sorry. I always have to say spoilers for history, but that was totally not legit. No, they Gerald Ashcroft lived until, goodness, I think 2010. But yeah, that whole scene up to it, if you want the Moonstone, you can have her. I was like, that is the dialogue, perfectly. If you want her, you can have her, but I'm taking her. And I always looked at that sort of just as, not only, Lights was pretty obviously a patriot who was like running around. He had fought in World War One. He had done that work for the Admiralty before as a sneaky spy. But he wasn't just going for the boys on the beaches. He was going for his son too, because he had a son on that beach. And I actually talked about this the other day on the channel. I was like, he didn't have a way to communicate. They had no way to communicate. So it was a father going for his son as well, which makes it beautiful. And he had a son with him. So, and then a teenager who was like a son to him, the Sea Scout. So he was a father, and
that's that kind of thing is, you wouldn't expect a person who was Light's age to willingly go into a battle zone. And Dunkirk is one of those historical pivot points in history. It has massive implications for Australia, but that's not where Lightoller and the Sundowner story ends, does it?
No. So it's going to be a rough battle, and I have this image of him. See, I always picture him younger, in my head when I put it. But at this point, Lights looked more like Popeye than a young man. There's actually a photo of him with a little, his pipe in his mouth, and he's trying to look like Popeye. And he's a little more bent over. He's, in his 60s, mid 60s, late 60s at this point. I do the math, but I'm too lazy. But he is older, and he's not in great health. He's older, but he's still fiery as all get out. And he did an interview on this on the BBC at one point, and you can actually go listen to him talk about this encounter. But he's on the way over, and he has Roger with him as well as Gerald. Takes a little bit. He tries to stay close to the HMS Worcester, which is giant warship. So he's like he's smart in that regard. He's a little yacht. He's capacity on that boat is 21 persons per the the board that signed off on its licensing. So he's not having many more than just family on board, and he takes the boat. He's kind of just sailing along. It takes quite a while to get out there, and then all of a sudden it turns into literal hell on earth. And that's the only way to describe the visuals of what he was seeing. Now that at this point, this is in June of 1940. This is past the initial May, the first May 2 or 3 days of this event. He's coming into it after the moles have been blown up, and people are gunning the beaches and shoot, and everyone's either having to duck and cover and wait for help. But the moles have been blown up at the end, so these ships that are larger cannot get to the men, which just hints the smaller little ships coming into the moles to pick up people from ships and ferry them either to other ships or back to England, depending on. He runs upon a crew of a boat that is it's a freighter, an oil freighter that is on fire. It's been damaged, and there are people on board. He grabs. It's not as many as he eventually ferries back to the UK, but he saves quite a few men off of this burning boat. And he's going to take them to the Worcester, which he's near. But these boys are traumatized. Then as they're driving away, the freighter explodes. So he saves everybody off that I don't, the number was pretty significant, but I don't remember the exact, but he freights those guys to another ship, and he climbs up on the Worcester, and he's, I always just picture him walking on like he owns the place, because I feel like that's how he walks on every boat, even if it's not his ship. And he goes up to the commander, and he's like, I've got a boat I can take. He's like, I'll go up to the beach if need be. But he's like, well, we're trying to clear the beach. I think the beach is cleared for the most part. We don't know. So he was going to go up to the beach, which not smart considering, it's consistently being bombed. But thankfully, in whatever serendipity happens, and this is one of Hitler's big mistakes, he slows down the line of panzers to wait on the rest of the army. So that buys some time. And so Lights is going in, and he's just like, I'll take some. Keep in mind the boat capacity for Sundowner is 21. And the man asked him, how many can you take? And I love this because Lights says the interview, he's so blasé. He goes, about 100. Where? Okay, about 100. And I'm reading this description of this in one of his books, and this is a book written by Patrick Stinson, and apparently his son Roger started to be like, and he was like elbows his son, like, shut up, because he says 100. So he starts gathering soldiers. I think mostly BEF. I don't know if it was any Free French forces, but he's grabbing members of the BEF, and he realizes to keep the boat afloat, he's going to have to start chucking things overboard. And one of the first things they have to do is he makes them throw away the artillery, all the guns, all the ammunition, which is not popular because they're like, hold up, wait. Well, sir, there are people shooting at us. What do you want us to do? So he's got Gerald Ashcroft and his Roger are down, and they're starting to just stack people like sardines, which is the cliche way to say it, but that's literally what's happening. And they're counting as many as they go on, and what I think he ends up getting at the last count, the last person, when he starts to feel the boat weight shift. And this is another thing I love, is that he was always so confident. He once got stranded on a desert island with a crew of about 40 and was picked up by this random ship 6 days later or so. And their boat was built for 6. And the captain's like, well, I can't leave any of you here because you'll all be dead by the time I can get somebody back to you. So they stacked in 40 people to get to New Zealand, I believe. And they all stack into this boat. So he had been on the receiving end of a rescue like this before. So he just starts like playing Tetris with the entire BEF, and finally they cut it off at 128, and they back it up. And I had one of the survivors' sons reach out to me via Facebook, and he sent me his father's account of this. And this was a Sergeant Reg King, and he was very much kind of not certain about. He's like, well, at first he was upset that they made him toss out his weaponry, but then he managed to make it down into the bottom where no one could see anything, and the rest of the crew were like pancaked on the top deck wherever they could fit. Reg finally made it down to the bottom, and somehow word had gotten out that Lightoller, he thought he was the only officer who survived, but they said that, oh, this guy survived the Titanic. That rumor began making its way around everybody, and he said the response was about 50-50. That 50% of the folks were like, oh, that's a good track record. Okay, good for him. Okay, so we feel good. And the other 50% was like, he survived. What about everybody else on the Titanic? We're doomed. Yes. So they said we thought he was a Jonah. So there was a 50-50 of uncertainty, but they just knew that they needed to get the hell out of Dodge because there was a Stuka. Is it Stuka? A Stuka? How do you say Stuka?
Just Stuka.
Thank you. My German is horrendous. A Stuka fighter that's coming buzzing the Worcester and has been. And Lights breaks away from the boat and they start heading back. And this is one of those things like where he knows how to shift boat weight because he kept the boat on the overturned Englehart collapsible on its top from sinking by just monitoring, having everybody shift. He had been on this boat where he'd been rescued, where he had been crammed in like a sardine, and he had done the same thing. And as he looks up, he realizes this is the plane that his son had been telling him about at breakfast that morning, just randomly. When he says, oh, it's fine even if you don't have any armor on the boat, if you watch it lock it dip by 7 degrees, you know the boat that it's locked at you and that you need to move out of the direction of the gun to the right, to whatever direction you need to go. Opposite if it's coming at you for a rear approach. And that's at that moment, and that scene in Dunkirk is actually done quite to what Lightoller describes it as. And he says, oh, we were having plenty of fun. We had some fun. Oh,
yes.
he described it as fun, I'm sure at the time. So he gives the helm to Roger, and he just watches, and he does the same thing. I love it. It's the same exact, the hand up to direct, lean this way, lean that way, steer the boat this way. And as he watches the nose of the plane dip, and he pulls his arm down, and Roger moves, and the bomb misses the boat by feet. The bomber does come back to take a second pass, and they do it again. And I guess the bomber got distracted by the Worcester and eventually starts chasing after the Worcester, which apparently got shot up pretty badly, according to that survivor account that I read. But it did make it back safely. But the BBC interview that Lightoller gave, he's talking about Roger at the helm, and he kept it pretty clean. He was like, oh, we had a little bit of fun on the way back, and he was very, but Gerald Ashcroft has a much more colorful account of what Lightoller was actually saying, and which is that he and you may bleep me out if you need to, but he was definitely shaking his fist and yelling at the bloody fucking Hun who was trying to blow up his boat. And that was
totally the example of purportment in British upper class.
Yeah, so the BBC interview was quite polite, but the exact thing was the bloody fucking Hun. That he called that was, I think, the insult. I'm not sure that the man heard him or cared, but the fight was still in him, even if he was that much older. Stop trying to blow up my boat.
Oh,
You
yeah.
bleepity bleepity. But I love how that was very much
Oh, yes. And
more
I'm looking at
persuasive.
photos online. So I just typed in Moonstone Dunkirk. And the first two photos is the boat they used for the Moonstone in Dunkirk. And immediately next to it is the Sundowner.
Yes.
And like these are identical boats.
Yeah, the pennant.
So if you want to have an idea, visual idea of what 140 men on the deck of the Sundowner look like, the scene is pretty accurate in Dunkirk and having all the soldiers on it, except that it wasn't 140 on the Moonstone.
It was it was 100. So it's 128 plus. Actually, no, I'm sorry. 127 plus the three the two Lightollers and Ashcroft, and so 130 with some on the deck, some below, and I can say that as I did get to go visit the boat, so I got to see
Yes.
this in person, and we can get that later. But eventually, of course, they are stacked in with I saw it with no fixtures and things and of that nature. So imagining like this thing with fixtures for like bedding and your everything that's in the bottom of the boat, the engine, the galley, and they're all this the whole time and getting rocked about violently all the way back. Some of them seasick. I'm sure it was just a disgusting delight of bodily fluids and from people being seasick, because that's what Reginald King said. He said it was everyone was seasick, and that they eventually pulled back into Ramsgate. At which point Lightoller gets out. Admiralty's counting. We don't have the complete list. I think those are still under lock. We don't know who the entire list of who was on the boat, but they began counting 1, 2, 3, and it gets to 126. And Lightoller's like, that is not right. Hang on. So he runs back down. He's looking, and he finds one of them had fallen asleep in the toilet. He had managed to sneak into the toilet. I guess he's like, I'm going in the toilet, and then he just passed out in there. And he's like, at 128. And then as he's getting off the boat, the Admiralty man looks at him and goes, "My God, mate, where'd you put them all?" And that was it. They made it back. So, Lightoller, I've been reading up on the history of the boat just from the Ramsgate Museum, which had it for quite some time. Did have a very, very detailed documentation. So I have part of Lightoller's logs as they're building the boat, some of the other things, but they say that when it was all good and everybody was counted for, he sent Roger home, but he stayed with the boat 2 more days because he hadn't heard whether Trevor had survived or not. And he's older. He's just like cleaning his boat out from everything. And he stays 2 more days until they get word that Trevor made it back. Trevor had made it off the beach 2 days before Lightoller had made it to the beach. So Trevor was gone by the time Lightoller got there. So that's but there was no way to communicate that. But they were home, and he went home, and sadly, Trevor would be the only son that survived the war. Roger almost. That's one of the hardest, saddest things. Roger almost made it. He died in 1945, about a month or so before the war ended, and also in a plane crash. Yeah, in France. He died in France. Yeah, so he passed in a plane crash. Shot down, I believe. I'm not entirely sure, but he is buried in France. I've looked this up. So he that was almost, I feel like that was in itself very devastating because he was very close to Roger. And he took him with him to Dunkirk. He's also close to Trevor. So Trevor ends up being the only Lightoller son to survive the war. And it becomes a very quiet life for him after that. He's not sailing much anymore. He does a few things as a Royal Naval Reserve toward the end of the war. Roger has a little girl named Daphne. The boat, after Lightoller died in 1952, he had been running a boat shop outside of London with Trevor. They ran a little, just like a little shipbuilder yard near the home, and he passed away during the Great London Smog. And they kind of sold the boat off. It kind of made its way around the world. It survived a hurricane. So whereas Lightoller was lucky, Sundowner continued to be lucky.
He made
Yes.
He made 3 more trips to Dunkirk for the 25th, 50th, and 60th anniversaries.
Yes.
Then,
actually under the command of his grandson, who he taught to sail.
And this is where we realized that this episode was not about Charles Lightoller, but it's actually about the Sundowner, which brings us to where we are now.
That took a while. Oh goodness. It's a long story. So I began looking for the Sundowner. I wanted to see this boat. I found out it still existed, and of course, I had found out that if Lightoller couldn't be killed, the boat couldn't. The boat sank once. It was fine. They pulled it out. It's been passed around ownership a few times. It ended up in the middle of a crime scene in Barcelona. That's the one that I haven't been able to find. Nothing. Obviously, Lightoller had nothing to do with that when he was far deceased, so he had an alibi. But the boat was there. But she had to find her way back to the Ramsgate Museum. She left out of Ramsgate. The Ramsgate Maritime Museum kind of has fallen into a state of there was a fire at the museum, and there's not a lot of financial. It was in a trust, and the trust didn't have the money for the upkeep to pay for the repairs. So instead, they signed it over to the man who had been doing the repairs on the boat, which I'm not quite sure with. I'm not familiar enough with charity trust in the UK to say anything about that, but it was a very interesting situation in which this man has this boat now and he can't take it's a priceless piece of history, but there's a dedicated group of volunteers that are trying to keep her safe, but she's rotting. They have paper over spots that have been painted white to hide rotting wood. There were spots that had been marked off with tape so that no one would step on it because you would fall through. And that's where this wonderful individual who owns a shipyard, his name is Stephen Dennett. His father's Michael Dennett. He owns his father's shipyard now, but his father still works for him, much like Lightoller. He's not giving it up in his old age. They restore little ships of Dunkirk, and he has a few there. And he wanted to go see Sundowner. He heard the story of it's the most famous little ship, and he goes to see it. And he said, I immediately realized that this boat was going to sink, and I love Stephen for this. He's a very funny man, because he just lays it on as thick as possible to this owner who's, he's a kind of innocent in all this. And he's like, I don't know what to do. And he's like, yeah, I think, mate, she's going to sink and she's going to end up in the Thames, and then everybody's going to hate you because you let Sundowner. He puts all this like thick, it's kind of funny. And he says, you should really find a buyer. He's like, let me ask around. So Stephen automatically begins he recognizes the historic value of the boat, and he begins going through this list of clientele he's working on their boats, but they've all made large purchases. But he's like, it's a special boat, but we got to get it out of Ramsgate. And he finds one of his friend John, who is he collects antique boats. So like, this is me. I'm coming in. I know nothing much about boating, but John's like, maybe I'll buy Sundowner. And he's like, John, you don't look like an eccentric millionaire. He's like, I'm not, but let's buy it. What's the worst? He bought it blind. And John and a crew of friends decide to bring Sundowner out of Ramsgate to Chertsey in Surrey, up the Thames. And as I said, they bought it blind. So there was a lot of shaking and shimmying when they turned the boat. It turned on. It started. And then the paint began coming off the walls. And somebody had to run and grab the portholes because some of the portholes began falling off. And they were like, well, we could either get a tow or we can just, try for it. And I guess they got an escort, but they made their way through with some people, hey, it's the Sundowner. Oh, that looks bad. It's the paint's coming off of it. They're trying to step around spots to not fall through. But they eventually get her very, very close to the dock in Chertsey, and all of a sudden it stops, and some water starts. The engine's not working, and some water is starting to come in. They're like, "Oh God, we're going to sink the Sundowner." And I truly somehow believe that somehow that boat channeled Lightoller's luck once more, because they kicked that engine up one more time, and it started one more time, just enough to get them up to where they could be towed onto the dry land. And then it gave out completely. And I'm like, if the boat's not possessed, it's feeling a little Christine-y. I was like, that's kind of funny. It's just, it gave one more hurrah before dying and making it to where it could be safe. And so now the boat sits on some bricks under a tent, and far worse than they ever expected it to be. So they brought in estimates. They're like, well, we can get it seaworthy again. And the quote was far more than either John, I think, or Stephen thought. Just to get it seaworthy, and we're talking not with fixtures, it's 300,000 pounds, I think, maybe up to 700,000 pounds. So that is the shape that this boat is in. This is after they've just purchased it as is, the Ramsgate just sold it as is. And it's like no take back. So they have her, and Steven's like, well, I'm not sure what to do. And John's like, well, we'll figure out something. And that's where my story kind of intersects with John and Steven, because I have no, like I say, I have no nautical knowledge. I've been on some boats, but I canoed at summer camp as a child. That's about all I have going for me. I've been on a cruise ship. I did the boat drills, but the thing was that I wanted to see this boat so badly. So I actually find the boat. I had to go through the Ramsgate Council because I was calling the Rams. It's still listed as being owned by Ramsgate. I finally edited the Wikipedia article myself because it was listed as being at the Ramsgate Museum. And I tried for months to get a hold of someone. There was no one there. I finally tracked down a Ramsgate Council member who gives me the spiel, gives me Steven's information. Say, hey, we've had to sell it. And I find Steven, I find the boat. And he's like, you could absolutely come and see the boat anytime you would like. And so I made a special trip to Jersey to see it. And he warned me. He's like, she's not good. She's languishing. And I kind of, it was heartbreaking just because you'd seen how beautiful the boat had been before. He took such good care of it. And here it was, rotting away. I was told that there's not much original to the boat. There's some of the control things. The hull is still the hull. The propeller is still the propeller. And the wood in the hull is been planked over, but some of it remains. So he asked me, I didn't want to seem impertinent because I was just looking at the boat, and he was showing me all the other little ships of Dunkirk, and he's realizing she's just here for Sundowner. He's like, you want to go inside? And I was like, yeah.
So how did that feel?
I was like, I didn't want to seem impertinent, but yes, sir, take me. So we had to get a ladder to climb up into the boat. It was fantastically fun. They stripped the deck of everything. I had seen her top, her canopy is, laying around. I saw some of the plaques from Dunkirk that they had put on her just historically after the fact. I'm sure the 20th years or something anniversary. And I'm walking, and I'm like, so how do I get down? He's like, well, I'm just going to drop you through this hole because there's not really a ladder. So there's this lovely, just drop. And then I'm in the boat and everything's been removed. But even with everything removed, I was like, how in the absolute hell did he fit? It's a large boat, but if you imagine with the galley and the cabins and then the walls and everything that was needed to make the boat home, which it was a motor home boat, it was not just empty, it would have been the tightest fit. So, and Steve's showing me where everything is. And of course the wood's rotting. There are mushrooms. I noticed mushrooms growing out of it. It had just been and it broke my heart just because he took such good care of this boat. He loved this. This was his boat. This was his baby, built from the ground up. I have his documents where he's just detailing exactly how he wants it and how he's fighting with the shipbuilder about everything. And it was a very humbling moment to be in that boat after having read everything that had happened with it. And how many lives were saved. I'm like, that grand moment of how many people are walking on this earth today because Charles Lightoller saved their fathers, their grandfathers. And
so you're walking on the deck. So you're walking on the deck of the Sundowner, or in the hull of the Sundowner by this point. How does that feel, considering this pseudo connection that you've created with a man who died 30 years before you were born?
Oh gosh, that moment. I don't know that it's because for the normal person to be like to try to explain the connection I feel, it was a very breathtaking moment. I had no doubt that I felt his presence in terms of that was his love that he put into that boat, that he loved that boat, and I knew I was there, and I felt overwhelmed by the history, overwhelmed by the sadness of the loss of his sons, and just and I felt very grateful because there's for whatever reason, my path crossed with Charles Lightoller's in a sense of a storytelling, and that gave me a platform on social media. And ever since then, I was like, well, I'll fight for this boat because I felt like I owed it to him in a way, just because his story had been so kind of cast as a side note in all this. And I just remember standing in that boat, and I think Stephen noticed, and he just kind of let me take it in because I stood there and I was filming, but also I just stood there. And Stephen has showed me the steering wheel and everything, and I got to hold the helm. And I don't know how much of it was original. He said a lot of the instrumentation had been changed out over the years. and the engine was not original, but what I was standing in, that hull, that deck, was the original. And that was, I went to a pub later and I had taken pictures. I hadn't noticed, and I absolutely actually cried in a pub, which I'm sure I'm not the first American girl who's ever cried in a pub in the UK. For less embarrassing reasons, but I realized, because some of the woodworking remained, and I realized that one of the first pictures I had of me on the boat was me standing on this wooden bench that remains. And I realized, when I looked at I was like, I know this. I pulled it up, and there had been, before his death, there was a photo of Charles and Roger sitting in that same spot that I had been standing on. And I lost it because I hadn't noticed it in the moment because I was so overwhelmed. But I was like, oh my, how had I just ended up like right on that bench, just walking on that bench? And I asked Stephen, because Stephen said that it was going to be difficult to save it, but they were going to. He's like, I don't know how we're going to do it. He's like, well, you can look into grants, but there's a lot of things that would have to be done to save it through grants. I know it's a little different in the UK. And it's not the same in the States. It's 501c3 nonprofit. But she'd already been in a trust before, and she was now in the States. So we're like, what are we going to do? We can't put her back in a trust. So I'm like, well, I'm very loud, but I'm good at asking for money. He puts me in touch with John, and after that we set up a website. John and I write a lot of copy for the website. John and I work together, and we set up Sundowner.online, and we began crowdsourcing for the boat, and that has been my project. And I'm actually going to go to the Dunkirk Association banquet in April. I'm pretty excited about it. I've been in touch with some of Lightoller's family members. It's a slow moving project. I knew it would take some time, but I told John, I was like, I want to help save this. I don't know what to do, because they're also kind of at a loss at this point. But to be there and to feel like, for some reason I discovered his story, and now I was here, and he doesn't have a grave. He was cremated, and his ashes were spread, surprisingly not in the ocean like I thought. He was spread in a memorial garden by his wife, and it's like, this is the last piece of this man on earth, is this boat. And she's languishing, and I decided that I was going to work. So that is a big part of I do my podcast. I do other history videos. I talk about a lot of things that interest me, but the main project, and I'm doing everything I can to crowdsource with John and Steve, and to rebuild her, at least to get her back to being seaworthy. And the updates, the modifications can come, but right now she needs a new engine, and she needs to be replenished. And before I left the boat, Steven told me to hang on, and he went up to the port, and he put his arm in, and he pulls this out, and he gives us a piece of the boat. And
do you have it?
Yeah, let me grab it. Hang on. I keep it in the plastic bag.
No, this is an audio podcast, but you're not seeing Melissa. So Melissa's run off to another room. She's been retelling me this story, and she's so animated. I've never seen someone so animated about something, about an inanimate object this passionate.
So this is a piece of the Sundowner.
It is huge. That is much bigger than what I thought it was.
Yeah, she's quite large. So he pulled this chunk off the wall, and he gave me this. It's inside, it had been planked over. This is a part of the original boat. So this is a part of Charles's boat, or Bertie's boat.
How does that feel to hold that?
Well, I cried like a baby when he gave it to me, because I knew that so much had been lost from it. That there wasn't much left of the original, but this is part of his boat. The wood it's old. It's been painted over a couple times before I can see other paintings. So it felt very overwhelming, but affirming. Like there was a good little sign, like, okay, I have this. And I feel like I've been trusted with a piece of this. And since I'm trusted with a piece of it, I'm like a mother. I'm like, I'm going to protect it. And I shipped it to myself home just so there would be no questions in U.S. Customs. Because I was like, what?
There's an old Australian adage, Chris.
Yeah, it's not a block.
There's an old Australian adage of that's going straight to the pool room.
Exactly. And she's kept in a Ziploc bag, which is very not befitting, but we will get her some sort of monument soon. But yeah, so he gave me a piece of the boat, and I cherish that, just because that was to me a sign that, okay, an acknowledgement. And I was like, I felt like, okay, I can't let her go. I can't I have to do something, and it may be far beyond my limited power, but in a way, it's opened up a lot of doors. I'm on your podcast talking about this now. I've been interviewed a couple times on this. I've been on, of course, Dr. Susie Edge's podcast. She's another TikToker who's had me on talking about this.
Mutual friend of ours, yes.
Mutual friend, the one and only. And she's she just refers to slightly obsessive obsession with this boat, but just slightly. But I feel like it was a lovely just how these stories connected. Like I would have never met John or Steve prior to this, I'm certain. And everything in Lightoller's life lined up so beautifully. He went through so many tragedies, and yet everything seemed to line up to lead to the prevention or protection of something else, something bigger. And I think we all want to look back at our life like that. And it's a beautiful sentiment. And just being on that boat, and I felt it very, very much. And I decided, I was like, I have to do something. So John and I talked, and we created a crowdsourcing page. We've got a website up and running about the preservation of the boat. We're going to document it. We've been working with a lot of people. We were interviewed by the paper in Surrey, and I'm like, that's I've made it international, Mall. Look at me. From Florida and I've just wrote an article for a British selling publication that's going to be coming out here shortly, and we know it's going to take a long time, but I'm 1,000% convinced we can do it. And then we're going to get to be in the Dunkirk Association banquet at April, where we get to talk about this. And I feel hopeful. I know it's going to be a challenge, but I think about Lights had 30 to 40 years on the ocean, and he nearly died how many times, and things would go wrong quite frequently, but he would considerably bounce back. And I'm like, I think he can wait another couple years as we work, and hopefully things will line up for us just as well. And his boat seems to have the same look. That boat had one more engine launch left in it to get it on dry land. So I think I have one more engine jump left in me that I can keep going and help out with this, because I want his legacy protected. It's an odd connection. I know.
Yeah.
Are you all right? Are you with love with the man? Are you? It's the ghost of Mrs. Muir, the old sea captain and the crazy woman writing the book. But no, it's I fell in love with his story, and I don't want it to vanish. And it feels like it would should the boat go away. So yeah, that's my story. It's the ghost and Mrs. Ratliff here, I suppose. But we are going to I have no doubt we'll save it. It may take some time, but there's a website, sundowner.online, where it goes into the history of the boat, and you can learn more about it and see photos of it and follow along with the building process as they do that.
Yes. So when's the book coming out?
Listen, there's a lot of writing going on, but we'll see. We'll see. Good to ask that question. I got to get some more money first, but yes, eventually I hope to do more with his project. But for now, I want to save that boat, and I think I think I will. I think,
and no doubt you will. No doubt you will. Like, the amount of passion that you put behind Lights and the Sundowner alone is just that's gonna push enough. There's gonna be a lot. So I think, as you said, we were running out of time in Zoom. Melissa, thank you for being on the show. I'll put all the links to everything in our show notes. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
And no doubt we'll continue talking once we're done recording.
Yeah, we'll keep talking. Yeah. All right. Thank you so much.
And there you have it, folks. I really want to thank Melissa again for coming onto the podcast and talking about a topic that she's incredibly passionate about. Now, Melissa Ratliff is a journalist in Sarasota, Florida. She's a Kentucky native who also creates history content on TikTok. She studied French and writing in university, and she's the host of God's Favorites, a history podcast. And it's mostly known for her obsession with Titanic's second officer, Charles Lightoller, as you've just heard. As of recording this outro, the GoFundMe for the Save Sundowner campaign has only £725 of its £400,000 goal. So as always, links to everything will be in the episode description if you want to know more. To follow Melissa and her travels through History Talk, she can be found at Melissa Fairlady, and to follow her journey to restoring the Sundowner, that can be found at www.sundowner.online. So catch you next time, friends. Bye. Thanks for listening to the I Was Only Doing My Job podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was written, produced, and audio engineered by me, Ross Manuel, with additional research done by Laurie Favell. I'd really appreciate it, and it would help out the show if you took some time to share this with a friend or leave a review on Spotify or Google Podcasts or iTunes or anywhere that you listen to podcasts, as it really helps other people find the show. If you want to know more about today's episode with photos, show notes, and transcripts, head to www.thedocnetwork.net and follow the show on IWODMJ on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. Don't worry, there's a link in the show notes. If you want to follow me for history-related hijinks and other nerdery, you can follow me on practically everything at Doc Winters. Once again, thanks for listening and catch you next time. Bye!